back, everyone. This is going to be our fifth weekly news segment. We've got a couple of things going on, some of which are a fair bit different than I wish they had been, and a few others that are actually very exciting. So let's just get into probably the biggest item this week as far as PC hardware is concerned. Is we have RDNA 2 Big Navi officially coming on October 28th in a combined Zen Navi event from AMD. They're going to be announcing new hardware across the board. This is, in a vacuum, this is fine. This is a big event. They're going to be holding it for basically their entire stack. But the problem here is that unless it is Navi is available to ship today, Ampere, the 3090, 3080, 3070, will have all been available for several weeks at this point. The 3080 is going to be available on the 17th. That's just going to be next week. The 3090 is going to follow very quickly after that on the 24th. And then the 3070 has a October date, which a lot of sources I've seen are pointing towards kind of the second week in October. If Big Navi is not available on the 28th, or if the performance data doesn't highlight it in a fantastic light, I don't really see how this is going to help AMD being in the shadow of these Ampere cards. Now, I could be completely wrong. Big Navi could show up and be the end-all be-all of graphics performance. I do expect it to be competitive, but launching a competitive product after your competitor already has an established foothold is not generally a winning strategy. Other hardware news, the Xbox Series S and Xbox Series X pricing is finally been released. We're looking at $499 for the larger console and $299 for the smaller one. And kind of a bigger item there is you can actually save money on these, assuming that you qualify for the way they're offering it and are interested in the Game Pass Ultimate with the monthly subscription options. We're looking at $35 a month for 24 months for the larger console and $24 a month for the smaller console. On its own, Game Pass Ultimate, unless you get it as a promotion somehow, is $14.99 a month. So basically, they're saying for an extra $10 a month, you can have the smaller Series S. For $20 a month, you can have the larger Series X. Over the course of 2 years, this works out to, I believe, a $50 or so savings over the price of just the console and just Game Pass. And that's with Game Pass having all the online play features that are in Xbox Live, free games, access to back catalogs, and as long as you're the type of person who doesn't mind waiting a couple of months for games, you're always going to have new games available if you choose to purchase the consoles this way. So this is definitely an interesting approach from Microsoft. Personally, I don't see myself shelling out for a console since I tend to be more interested in PC hardware, but based on what shows up in that back catalog, since the Series S and Series X are going to be 100% backwards compatible, there's definitely console games that I've been interested in playing, and the option to pony up less money than I pay, monthly for parts of my cell phone bill to have access to that is not a terrible option. I already have subscriptions for things like GeForce Now, which, by the way, if you want us to cover GeForce Now and Stadia and the game streaming services, leave us a note in the comments and we'll do our best to compare some of those. So I do think it's an interesting approach, and I think it's one that's going to get Microsoft more people interested in the console. It also is going to bring people in who wouldn't have had the option to buy the console previously and potentially make more money for Microsoft in the long run if they do choose to purchase games on release day. So I do think this is a long game approach and a rather good one on Microsoft's part as far as the console market's concerned. Western Digital is back in the news this week, and not for good things. They've been caught trying to redefine what a pretty basic engineering term RPM really means, and selling drives as things like 5400 RPM class. Now, I've seen that label on drives before, and what I had really generally assumed it to be is not what they're doing at all. So, my initial assumption when I saw RPM class on a drive is that it wasn't exactly 5200 or 5400 RPM. It would be a 5900 RPM drive, which we've seen Seagate sell drives as 5900 RPM or a 5000 RPM drive for enhanced lifespan, something close to 5400 but not actually 5400. That's not it at all. These are 7200 RPM drives that don't actually perform like 7200 RPM drives, they perform like 5400 RPM drives. If they had performed like a 7200 RPM drive, I don't think people would be quite as upset as they are. And what they have found through testing is that these drives are consuming power like they're a 7200 RPM drive. They're making noise like a 7200 RPM drive, and they have derated lifespans compared to what would be a typical 5400 RPM drive in their class, all while performing just like a standard 5400 RPM drive. So it uses more power, it makes more noise, and it gives you no benefit. I don't really understand what their end goal here was, if it was not just to upset people. If it was a slow or a bad performing 7200 RPM drive, no one would be upset right now because they wouldn't have lied about it. Instead, they've tried to redefine RPM, revolutions per minute, pretty straightforward technical fare there, as something that it's not, and in doing so really further devalued their name. This is after the whole unlabeled shingled magnetic recording drive fiasco just a few months ago. So this is a really big misstep on Western Digital's point. When they need to be gaining their customers' confidence, they seem to be doing everything they can to lose. It's very disappointing as someone who used to regard Western Digital as really one of the better hard drive manufacturers. I used to use WD Reds and all sorts of stuff. I don't anymore. And that's kind of disappointing to say. In Android hardware news, we have the Razer 5G coming to T-Mobile with a rather astonishing price of $1,400. I get it. I get that flexible display tech is expensive, but I think there's a couple of things here that they could have done differently to bring that price down a bit, and also actually generated a better user experience at the same time. So for those of you who don't know, the new Razer 5G is a folding clamshell Android device with, I believe it's a 6.8-inch OLED. We'll have the specs flash up on the screen. It's basically not a flagship, but as close as you can get using things like the Snapdragon 765. And they've made some bad choices on the hardware side here that really kind of just take my excitement in buying something like this away. The odd aspect ratio I could deal with. There's definitely opportunities to use that for things like a 16:9 game section with controls on the sides, or just letterboxing certain content that doesn't conform to the screen. But they've got a big notch cut out in the top of the screen for the selfie camera, which doesn't make any sense. You've got a 40 megapixel main camera on the outside of this phone when it's folded, and a small touchscreen on the outside. If I want to take a selfie, just fold it and use the main camera. Don't give me a notch cutting out on my screen. There's no reason to have done that, and that's money and space that could have been used for things like a headphone jack, things like a micro SD card slot that, if it shipped with the two of those, no notch, and just one big main camera, 1400's a bit steep, but I might actually consider it. So they've taken a good concept, this folding clamshell phone, which the idea of protecting the main screen like that has merit. 100% sold on folding phones yet, but it's certainly a good idea. And they've made a couple of missteps here. I'm sure people will still get it because it is the Razer. It is that iconic phone that everyone had years and years ago. I mean, I remember being a Sprint customer in 2009 and having not a Razer, but the Nextel variant, which was just a Razer with armor on it to protect it a bit more. And they were solid phones. So they've taken a good idea and executed it poorly, which is unfortunate. That said, I don't think it's going to be a terrible device out of the gate. They've just made choices that I don't inherently agree with. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everyone loves notches and cutouts and punch holes and all these missing headphone jacks, things that I think are just terrible design decisions. Or maybe they're really just about cutting cost and delivering the bare minimum. If you've got an opinion on that, let me know in the comments. Tell me I'm wrong. Um, Tell me I'm right. Tell me something so I can get a feel for what you guys actually care about. Speaking of phones, Microsoft is actually trying to change their reputation here, and they're doing all the things right so far. So with the Surface Duo, I don't necessarily like its availability, but they've released the kernel source this week. The bootloader is shipping unlocked, and they've made a pledge to, at minimum, update it with recent builds of Android for 3 years. So if I'm trying to get into the smartphone game, and obviously it waits to be seen if they actually hold true to that, or if they do, 3 years of updates as just one big update every year, as opposed to monthly security patches and whatnot. Um, these are the things that you have to do. So shipping the kernel source is great, and not every Android manufacturer plays by the rules here, but the ones that do are generally appreciated. That makes it much easier to build custom ROMs. I mentioned that before when I was talking about the Zenfone 7. Shipping the bootloader unlocked out of the gate is fantastic. That means I don't have to go download some utility and unlock it. If I have a ROM that I've built, I can flash it, and that's great. I understand that some devices may not want to ship that way for security concerns. Samsung's Knox comes to mind for enhanced security. But as a rule, that actually is a very Microsoft way of doing things. That makes the phone that much more like buying a PC. If I buy a Surface from Microsoft and I don't like the build of Windows 10 that's on it, I can get a Windows 10 installer and just wipe it clean and start from scratch. Or I can go download an ISO image for Fedora or Ubuntu or Debian or any other Linux distro or BSD or anything else I want to put on there, short of Mac OS, because Apple doesn't really want you to, and install it. So that is just one step more towards making the phone like a PC. And Microsoft has made their missteps in the phone arena before. So we'll see how this turns out um, over the next year at least, to see how their update record holds up. And you know what? If they release a Surface Duo 2, if it's available on my carrier, maybe if they follow it up with Surface, I don't know, Solo or Surface Slate, some kind of single screen device that still holds true to these where do I want to use these values, this level of openness, I could see myself actually using a Microsoft phone. And to be honest, I wasn't against Windows Phone when it was available. I just couldn't buy one. It was never available on the carrier I was on, even though the same hardware that I had was available running, I want to say that was Windows Phone 7. So I had an HTC phone, and literally the same hardware ran Windows Phone on AT&T. Um, so I think the big thing that they need to do, they're doing all of these things right. The next thing that they need to do to continue to do things right is not have the phone be an AT&T exclusive. Continuing to be exclusive to a single carrier like that, I think, is going to kneecap them in their endeavor here. Speaking of Android, however, It's been cranked up to 11. Android 11 officially released this week, and some devices, I believe the Pixels and the OnePlus 8, have already seen updates to it. I'm sure I'll see an update myself on my 7 Pro in a few months. There's a couple of things that I'm very excited to see in Android 11, and then there's one I'm not super stoked about. So, just at a glance, there's a lot of things that are being done right here, and some of these aren't necessarily new, some of these are refinements of existing features, and that's where we are. It's not like the Android 2, 3, 4 days where we got big, shiny new features every build. We're getting one or two new things and lots of little refinements and tweaks behind the scenes, too. So, we've got built in screen recording coming, so there's no more need for third party utilities or using something like an external HDMI capture device to record the screen. We've got one time permissions, which I swear I've seen before, and maybe this is something that certain manufacturers have added and it's just finally being incorporated into Android 11 as a whole, but we have the option to grant permissions to apps now. Full stop, only a single time. So you open something up, you really don't want to use it that often, you give it permissions to do something once and that's the end of it. So that's good. That's a good security choice. We also have a automatic permission revocation feature. And I don't know the full details on this, if this is something that you have to run manually or if it's going to be something that you can say, do this every week. But it will automatically revoke permissions from apps that have not been used in a certain period of time. So if I don't use an app for, we'll say, 6 months, um, we'll say it's Instagram. You haven't used Instagram in 6 months, or Twitter. You just stopped using it. It will take its permissions away, and it doesn't uninstall the app or do it permanently. If you open it up again, it's just going to ask for its permissions again. But automatically removing them prevents abuse. So, not that I think either of those would be particularly terrible, although I'd be wary of anything Facebook touches. Um, if someone updates an app to automatically, steal your data, some sketchy third-party Chinese app that you've installed on something, just some sketchy third-party app that you've installed to do something, it can't be updated and steal your data just because you haven't touched it in a year. It'll have all of its permissions taken away. So, from a security standpoint, I actually like this idea, and from a usability standpoint, as long as it can be done automatically at set intervals and doesn't and it has a variable slider for how long it could be. I used a week earlier as an example. That might be too short of a range. I'm sure there's apps that some people use only once a week. This is going to be a good feature, and this is going to help, well, generally everybody who gets Android 11. The one I'm not sold on is this camera redirection limitation. What Google has done in Android 11 is that your default camera app, so if I open up something and I say take a picture and it asks me what app I want to use, can't be anything other than the stock camera app that came with your phone. Now, for some phones this isn't really a problem, and for some people this isn't a big deal. But I tend to replace my stock camera with open camera because I like having more manual controls than I get out of the camera that's shipped with the phone. So for some apps, we'll use Instagram as an example here again, their built-in camera is going to work just like it is. But for an app that asks me to take a picture and then asks me what camera I want to use with it, so we'll say, if I wanted to run an image search, if I wanted to go to a web page, I hit the button and ask me to upload a picture, and then I can say I want to take one with my camera of an item I'm trying to identify. It's only going to let me use the default camera. So that's taking people's ability to do things away, and I don't know how set in stone this is. I don't know if certain OEMs are going to break it or just disable that feature, and I don't know if maybe they'll decide it was a bad idea and it'll go away with Android 12. I understand this is at least being propped up as a security and privacy issue where They want to make sure that things like location data and whatnot don't get left on and sent to these third-party services. I'm not 100% sold on that. I think this might just be attempt to kind of strong arm some of the third-party camera apps out. And I know some of them aren't necessarily built well. So maybe this is a good thing still. But the reality remains to be seen on that. One last note, CES is going to be online only this year. I don't know if any of you have gone to CES before. Paul usually goes. It was on my list to go eventually, and this year it's going to be online. So we'll definitely be able to cover more of it, since it won't just be whatever Paul sends us back and a handful of briefings that are online. It'll all be online. I've already registered to attend. This is the first time CES has been online only in a decade. And for some companies, this is going to be beneficial. And for others, I think this is going to hurt them. Some of the big names, it's going to be easy to grab people's attention online. But anyone trying to be new is going to have a harder time getting the equal time and equal attention. Whereas before, if they had a booth, you walked by it, it's going to grab your attention when you walk by. So we'll see how it plays out once all's said and done. This should be interesting, to say the least. Finally, I mentioned in my unboxing, although that actually hasn't aired yet, so I'm just going to mention it now. This was all recorded using that new USB video capture device that I've used before. Typically, I use my Zcam E4, which is my 4K camera, and it's only 1080 out on the HDMI anyway, and use my Flint 4K. This time I actually use that Panasonic that I show in that unboxing, as well as my new $10 HDMI capture device. And so far I haven't edited the footage yet, but it seems to be working fine, so I'm perfectly happy with how it's been behaving. The Panasonic camera, not so much. It shut the output off on me a couple of times, but that's not. So that said, I'll publish a full review of it, but there'll be a link to it in the description below. This little device for $10 captures a 1080 output just fine. I want to take a moment to thank Electrix for our opening and closing themes, as always. Definitely check him out, and he does open source music and he does custom music, so send him a note if there's something that you need music for. I'm very happy with working with him so far. I want to thank our patrons who help make content like this possible. Check that out in the description below if you're interested in helping support Pocketables. And I want to thank you all for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, maybe we missed a news story, leave us a note in the comments below. And if there's something that you see happening during the week that you want us to cover, or if you want us to cover any of these things in full depth in a dedicated fashion, let us know and we'll do our best to make it happen. Thank you for watching.